Well, good evening, everyone, or good afternoon. Welcome to the MCA and to the MCA's aircon this evening. My name's Lami Debussy. I'm the Director of Engagement here at the MCA. I'd like to acknowledge this incredible place we're all gathered here this evening on Talawalada, home of the Gadigal people, their stories, their culture, their art for over 60,000 years. They are the traditional owners and custodians of these lands and the waters just beyond that door, and the MCA would really like to pay our respects to elders past, to elders present, and to those who are emerging. We also like to welcome and acknowledge those First Nations colleagues we may have in the room. Welcome to the MCA. Thank you for joining us for this final event in Image Complex, which is a 2023 lecture series on vision and visuality that is co-presented by the MCA and the Power Institute. Tonight's event and the series as a whole are part of a larger and very exciting collaboration between Power Institute and MCA Australia. It's called, very excitingly, the Visual Research Program. And over 3 years, our two organisations will work together on a set of new projects, digging into the museum's collection, exhibitions and archives, and furthering the Power Institute's research into the contemporary art, science and politics of vision. At the heart of this collaboration is a dialogue with scholars and artists from around the world, including thinkers like our speaker tonight, Jack Halberstam. Welcome. Underpinning our partnership is a real shared belief in the immense importance of contemporary art and visual culture. As we pursue our research over the coming years, we'll continue to check in with all of you and share our progress and bring you into the conversation through publications, through events and more. So please do keep an eye out. I know a lot of you are on mailing lists and checking the website, so do keep doing that. There's more to come. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Nicholas Croggan, who's Programs Coordinator at the Power Institute, and Jack Halberstam.
Nyinyi Nalawangun Mari Bujari Gadi Norada. Welcome everybody. My name's Nick Croggan, and as Lami just mentioned, I'm the Programs Officer at the Power Institute. I wanted to begin by risking a few words in a language not my own to mark my position as a guest here and to convey my respect to the Gadi people whose unceded land we're on tonight. And I extend that respect to Gadi elders past, present and future, and to all Indigenous people who've made it along tonight to hear our lecture. So this lecture is part of a series of public talks entitled Image Complex, which, as Lami mentioned, is a collaboration between the MCA and the Power Institute. The term Image Complex was coined by US activists and scholars Yates McKee and Meg McLagan, and they used it to describe the infrastructures that have produced and sustained the visual world of the late 20th and early 21st century. So the image complex is not just one place or one thing, but rather an always shifting network of ideas, of people, of institutions, technologies, and platforms. At stake in the image complex, thus, is not just the content of what we see, but rather what is seeable and the significance ascribed to that seeability. Image complex points to a longer history of vision understood not as something universal, unchanging, or natural, but rather as a crucial site of historical and political contestation. Also at stake in image complexity is the coexistence of many different major and minor histories and practices of vision. So over the course of 2023, and if you've missed previous lectures in this series, they've been recorded and are up on our website. We have heard from a number of scholars who've helped us understand the contours and the longer history of image complexes. We heard from Nick Merzroff, Orad Halpern, Krista Thompson, and tonight we have the great pleasure of hearing from Jack Halberstam. So each of these thinkers offers an important new vocabulary for thinking about art and visuality, one that centres colonial histories and diasporic formations, histories of science and technology, radical Black aesthetics, and queer and trans ways of life. These thinkers and perspectives, I think, allow us to see the image complex not as an immovable machine of domination, but as an unstable and contingent assemblage whose future is far from fixed. So today I'm extremely honoured to be sharing the stage with Jack Halberstam. Jack is visiting us here in Sydney from the City of New York, where he is the David Feinson Professor of the Humanities at Columbia University. I first met Jack in 2017 when, as a PhD student, I was lucky enough to sit in on one of his classes. I can't actually recall what the exact subject matter of our discussion was then, but what has remained with me is the way in which Jack dissolved with seeming ease the lattices of hierarchies and anxieties that we brought into that room, and to create in its place a space for elastic and genuinely convivial thinking that seemed to crackle with possibility. If you have read any of Jack's writings over the past 30 years, which includes 7 books and innumerable articles, you know what I'm talking about. So with this in mind, we're going to start today's event with a quick conversation to help us get into such a space, perhaps, but also to frame the places and people that have made Jack's own practice and his current working and project possible. So firstly, thank you, Jack, for being here, and welcome to Sydney.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
I wanted to start by asking you about swimming, because I know it's something that you've been doing a bit of since you've been here. And I wondered, knowing your work, whether you had a theory of swimming, or whether you think of swimming as a model for a type of practice, or a type of thinking, or a type of way of life.
Yeah, I mean, I'm supposed to be writing a little book actually on swimming that came to me right before COVID. I realized that wherever I went, I would go and look for the pool or the swimming hole. And it became like a really important part of how I got to know a place, but also, you know, how to have a bit of downtime. But it's more than that, isn't it? Swimming it's immersion in an environment that humans can't live in. And so it's this sort of radically other element. And there's something about that, the quiet as well, you know, not being online. There are all these headphones you can get to swim in, and I do not want those. And also the way in which the world is muffled when you're swimming, that you hear, but you're hearing through water, and so there's a radically altered relationship to your environment. And of course, in a moment of eco-critical jeopardy, all the places that we swim that are not swimming pools are also increasingly degraded and polluted. And so swimming now is actually really different from what swimming was when I really began swimming in earnest, maybe 20 or 30 years ago. And yeah, it's a practice. It's a practice. There are these little books that Duke does where people write about something that ends in ing. So there's running and cycling, and I'm sort of trying to write this swimming. But the other piece is there's an artist, Adam Pendleton, who he's a really amazing Black artist who put together a book called Black Dada. And he asked me to be the subject of a video portrait right at the end of COVID. And I said, no, I'm not good at that. I'm not good on the camera. I don't want to do it. And he said, oh, don't worry. You know, I'll worry about that. And he said, what have you been doing during COVID? And I said, I teach, I walk, I swim, you know. And so he basically followed me around and made this beautiful film that includes footage of me swimming, not really swimming, mostly when I'm just sort of bobbing around in the water. And it was really extraordinary to see him take this practice and turn it into an otherworldly set of images. And so thinking about the image complex, and it was weird to be in the image complex rather than talking about it. It's profoundly humbling to be the subject of the camera as opposed to the person who's trying to make sense of the flow of images. It was a very uncomfortable experience, and it's a very awkward film, to be honest with you. It's not easy to watch. But yeah, there's something there. There's something about how you know someone through his method that's really different. Mm-hmm. And swimming had a lot to do with that.
Okay, when is the book coming out?
Oh, no idea at this point. Yeah, because I'm still trying to finish this one. But it's something that I just keep working on as I go.
In the background. Well, on the topic of your current work, which is about wildness, and I know that we're going to hear about that later on. The first book that you wrote about wildness a few years ago is about this concept of wildness, and you do a reading through literature, and it made me think that it's a return in some ways to some of your earliest work, which was in literature. I'm thinking of your book from 1995, which was called Skin Shows, which was about the Gothic, the different forms of the Gothic, and the figure of the monster and monstrosity. And I was wondering if you could say perhaps a little bit about why the Gothic was a kind of jumping platform for you, and whether there is some kind of relationship between monstrosity and wildness, or between those two projects.
Yeah, actually that's very perceptive, because when I had finished Wild Things, I realized that it was covering some of the same terrain. And my first book, it was sort of from my dissertation, and I remember going to talk to my dissertation advisor, and I said, I don't know what I'm doing. And she said, well, what are you interested in? And I said, I was watching a lot of horror. I said, lots of horror, monsters. And she said, right, you're writing about the Gothic. And I sort of fell in love with the monster, which is, after all, a figure for everything that is outside of the norm, and that we're supposed to be scared of, but that actually represents a different kind of force, a different form of individuation. Frankenstein is cobbled together of many, many different parts of people. He is in and of himself an assemblage. And vampires sort of are like queers. They convert people to their way of life, which we do. We don't tell people that, but that's what we do. But monstrosity is also a deeply racialized concept. And so in that book, I was thinking about the way in which the monster reflects the particular fears of any given era. And Wild Things returns to that same terrain in my investigation of the zombie, for example. And it was hard. That book was hard because the wild is a very, you know just from hearing the word, it's a deeply vexed word. It is a product of a civilizing discourse that understands some people to be on the sort of upward trajectory of evolution, and others to be inscribed within the wild, awaiting their civilization. And so it was, what was difficult was wiping the taint off of wildness, which is not only what civilization says it is, it's also a relationship to the environment that doesn't seek to domesticate it. Wildness is that which cannot be controlled by the human. And wildness obeys a very different logic and a different understanding of order. So I think it takes a counterintuitive topic and looks to see what's available there.
Mm. And I guess in terms of contrasting those two projects, obviously the first book, Skin Shows, and then your following book, which I think is perhaps one of your best known works, which was called Female Masculinity from 1998. And both these works were produced during the 90s, which was, looking back, such a volatile time in terms of the emergence of negative forces that are still with us, like the kind of reassertion of family values and techno-utopianism, and experiences of immense loss and mourning. But then on the other hand, this kind of fluorescence of artistic and theoretical creativity, right. The sort of dawning of queer studies as a field. How did you experience that decade as someone who became an academic and a scholar in that decade? Yeah,
that was pretty exciting for me. That was the book I wanted to write, but didn't feel like I could academically. It's funny, I have to talk to my students now about how different it was to go on the job market as a sort of gender ambiguous person at that time. My advisors, one piece of advice to me was, the search committee has to know as soon as you walk in the room what gender you are. and so dress appropriately, you know. And so writing that book was deeply important to me. I was not part of the sort of elite group of people who had started queer theory and had pioneered it in the various Ivies that they were in, and I was sort of on the margins writing this book. And I still think that book has work to do because masculinity in women remains the mark of a kind of ugliness or something that has to be rejected, or is the, you know, stereotypical sign of lesbianism that even queer people want to push away from, is not swallowed up by new understandings of trans. And, you know, so it's still this really kind of an abject category that people don't know what to do with.
Mm. And in the kind of introduction to that book, you remark on how female masculinity is this kind of category that is so suppressed and ignored in histories of gender variance and in histories of feminism. And there's so much to say about this book, but one thing I wanted to draw out was in an interview about this book, you talked about a kind of taxonomic impulse, in that one of the features of this book is to outline not just one female masculinity, but many different modes of female masculinity, and to, in a way, describe and list those.
Yeah.
But of course, lists and taxonomies are things that we tend to think of in negative terms, especially when it comes to identity. Mm-hmm. What was at stake in that for you, that taxonomic impulse?
Just to pull taxonomizing away from medical and legal actors, and recognize that in fact a lot of the ways in which people find a category is through vernaculars. It isn't that a doctor tells you, oh, you're a homosexual, and now you take that on. You actually find yourself in community with others where those communities have designed and devised their own ways of talking about who they are. And so butch is not a medical category, but it was at that time a deeply important vernacular category. Likewise, nowadays, non-binary is not a medical category, but it's come to describe some 20% of all young people, precisely because young people, looked around and thought, well, we're being asked to be either cis or trans, and isn't there something else? Aren't there other gradations in between? And I think part of the global pushback on trans issues right now, apart from the fact that we're living in an era of sort of deeply conservative, almost fascist and authoritarian power regimes, many of them target trans youth and trans movements precisely because this is a place of agency and alternative political organizing. And you'll see tonight, a lot of the people that I'm talking about under the heading of Anarchitecture, which is a portmanteau that brings together anarchy and architecture, happen to be trans artists. And there's something about that unbuilding impulse, the desire to take things apart, that is available in that category of non-binary as well.
And there's so many different practices in that book that you describe and think about, but I was wondering if you could perhaps say a little bit about the kind of community of thinkers that you were part of at that time, the influences and the other thinkers around you that sort of empowered you to do what was within the academy and the university not fully legitimate as a field of study.
Yeah, oh gosh, I have no idea. It's so long ago now. I think it kind of took me writing that book and writing particularly about drag kings, for example, to find my way into these para-academic communities, communities where people were making art and culture as opposed to necessarily crafting theories. And I loved that. But at the same time, there's always a lot of tension between practitioners, artist communities and academics, and there was also tension there, this sense that like, oh, you're coming into our community to write about us, we're not so happy about that. We want to write about ourselves. And so it pushed me a little bit back into an academic context where, and so the next book, The Queer Art of Failure, was much more of an academic book for that reason. I found myself a bit disenchanted with writing about people who didn't think that we were collaborating but saw me as potentially poaching. But it was great because in The Queer Art of Failure I started writing much more about art. And I think actually, part of what I'm presenting tonight goes back to that terrain of failure and disappointment and this kind of negative inscription that seeks to undo structures in the world rather than build new ones. So it pushes away from that taxonomical impulse and asks the question, can we unmake this absolutely treacherous world that we live in? I think very few people today would think that we're in a happy place, that we settler colonial kinds of nations who world build have done something good. And if you don't think that settler colonialism has resulted in something good, you're going to have to figure out how to unmake it. And that's the question, I believe, that's asked by Anarchitecture.
Mm-hmm. And one of my favorite factoids about that book is that you were thinking when you were writing it about calling it "Dude, Where's My Theory," which
oh yeah, or "Dude, Where's My Car?" Yeah.
But one of the sort of targets of that book as well was the kind of discourse of success and failure, and reading it, it strikes me as is sort of grounded in a particularly US experience of capitalism. And I wonder, having been in the US for such a long time now, do you feel differently about what's possible in that country today compared to 10 years ago?
Less is possible. I mean, it's true everywhere. The consolidation of global capital, as we can see in the current crisis that we're inhabiting, where it's impossible to say things that are happening in the world without being charged with, you can't say genocide is happening in Gaza without being charged with anti-Semitism, despite the fact that you might have been one of the people who has written about anti-Semitism. And, Judith Butler has been writing valiantly about this in recent days, that to curtail speech in this way, it's not really about anti-Semitism. These governments do not care about anti-Semitism. They are the authors of anti-Semitism. What they care about is that they should be unimpeded in their efforts towards wiping original peoples off their lands, unimpeded as they did in the past, now they want to do in the present. And I think the fact that so many young people are saying no and speaking out against it is scary, and so things are way worse for us at this point. And academia, which is now, I think people recognize that many of these critiques come out of academia, this is the new method to shut down complex critique, is to manage free speech on campus. So it's a very, very difficult time to have political conversations, and I think it's only going to get worse.
Well, on that slightly grim note, I was going to segue and skipping a few texts, but coming back to your Wild Things project.
Let's not exhaust everyone before the...
Because I know you're about to start, but I wanted to quickly ask, and if you're going to talk about this in the talk, then ignore the question. I know that the idea of wildness was something that you explored kind of in collaboration with Jose Esteban Munoz and Tavia Nyong'o, and I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that community of thought that you found on the East Coast when you moved.
Oh yeah. No, that was, well, sadly I moved to the East Coast after Jose passed, but Tavia and Jose and I had planned to write a book on wildness together, which would have been very different from the various texts that we came up with separately. We were trying to push back on something that was, at the time, was a big deal. Do you remember object-oriented ontology? Oh my God. Anyway, we wanted to push back on that, and because object-oriented ontology is a branch of philosophy that imagines what world looks like from the vantage point of the object rather than the subject. but it has no interest in, for example, anti-colonial thought from people like Fanon, or for that matter, Fred Moten, who is the person who has mostly theorized what happens when the object, i.e. in his work, black people descended from slaves who have been commodities, are, sort of speaks back. Yeah, and we imagined wildness as something that emerged out of this terrain of the environment of anti-colonial discourse, queer theory, trans theory, and would oppose therefore this sort of universalizing object-oriented ontology. But once we were not doing it collaboratively, I was like, I don't care about so I sort of dropped it.
That sounds like a good one.
Yeah.
Well, let's hear more about it. Thanks so much, Jack.
All right, thank you.
Thanks for coming out on such a weird, hot day. I am super excited to be here, and as I suggested, I'm just going to share with you some of the work from this new project that I'm doing on, as the title suggested, an aesthetics of collapse that reaches back to the 1970s and specifically to the work of Chilean artist Gordon Matta Clark, who was a trained architect who, and this is great for grad students, who went to college at Cornell and got a graduate degree in architecture, and then came back to a New York City that was really decrepit and actually falling down in many, many different ways, and we'll talk about that, and decided that what he wanted to do with his architectural training was unmake things and unbuild things. And so he crafted this incredible method of cutting, slicing, and introducing space into buildings that had previously been abandoned. So that's the actual meaning of Anarchitecture. And the legacy of it is a vocabulary, and I would say an aesthetic language of collapse. Now, why is this important? Well, as I just said, this is important because we're living at a time when the world as it is framed as world, which is mostly framed by colonial nations on behalf of neo-colonial and global capitalist projects, needs to shift and change and come apart in order for something else to happen. And therefore, while I'm not an activist, I can't tell us how politically to unmake the world, I think we can look to art for a different political vocabulary and look specifically to Anarchitecture to figure out what will be some of these languages that we can use to tell each other how to unbuild everything. Okay, so through this talk, I'm going to begin by talking about a recent trans artist who I think is using in really interesting ways an Anarchitectural vocabulary. Then we'll look at what I call demolition porn and see what use a very cool queer black artist from the 1970s made of demolition porn. And then we'll move into a theory of collapse and then wrap it up from there. So that's where we're kind of going to go. And Gravity is the name of, Gravity Road is the name of a piece by the first artist I'm going to talk about. Entropy is in fact the physics of collapse and is quite important to thinking with natural processes. Gravity, pulls us down, and entropy in many ways places us in relationship to the world as a kind of unraveling force. Order has to be imposed, entropy exists, and collapse, as we'll see, will be the mainstay of this aesthetic vocabulary that will unfold as we go. So here's my first case study. I don't know if people know this artist. Yeah, Jessie Darling, whose work I've been following for some 5 years and thinking about, and who amazingly won the Turner Prize last week. And so I thought this is a great moment to bring Jessie Darling's opus into conversation with this work that I'm doing on Anarchitecture. And when the award was given, this is the kind of description that people gave of his work. One person said that
that she wanted to praise the artist's ability to manipulate materials, quote, in ways that skillfully express the messy reality of life and expose, quote, the world's underlying fragility. So that's also the purpose of an aesthetics of collapse, to point to the precarity with which we live rather than cover it up. And he does this in almost every piece that he makes. Another commentator said, this is the director of the Tate Museum, and the chair of the prize jury said in an interview that Darling, quote, manipulated banal objects in ingenious ways to produce work evoking a society on the verge of collapse. So there it is, this tethering of this work that you can see in the background. Darling makes these sculptures out of everyday banal objects, like these gates and fences, and he turns them into objects that are just about balanced, but are always in the process of toppling over. Here's the piece that I want to talk about for a minute. This is called Gravity Road. This is from 2020, and this is a piece that Darling created and this is interesting since Nick mentioned swimming, in a German gallery space that was converted from an old swimming pool. And the piece, Gravity Road, is supposed to conjure a roller coaster. And so you can see that the road is in fact these rails, the rails that we associate with the roller coaster, but this is precisely a roller coaster on which you would have to go off the rails. So we see a deconstructed rolling roller coaster that sets up a kind of platform seemingly for speed and childhood leisure, for collective thrills, and of course for collapse. So I'm going to come back to this later, but there's a way in which the image conjures a form of leisure and pleasure that it cannot deliver on. And so that might be one way of thinking about collapse, but it's also a reminder that many of the platforms that we travel on are themselves on the verge of collapse. But I also like the way in which we can't tell the difference in the space between the sculpture and the detritus of making something. All have sort of equal value in this space. The shards of the installation litter the ground. And we don't quite see the swimming pool here, but it will come up in a later slide. So think about that work and what it's doing while I show you some of these images from Gordon Matta Clark so that we can establish the vocabulary with which we're working. This is a piece called conical, I can't remember this actual piece, but it's from 1975 when Conical Intersect, when Gordon Matta Clark was invited to be part of the Biennale in Paris that year. And in that year, the Centre Pompidou was being built. And in order to build this new museum that is now a kind of architectural marvel, huge parts of Paris had to come down. And so in the neighborhood of the Centre Pompidou, 2 17th century townhouses had to be unmade. So one of the things that Matta Clark does that's very suggestive is he takes buildings that have been abandoned and then builds into them a sort of force of demolition. And in the process, what he's doing in many ways is offering us a critique of gentrification and improvement and development, and offering, instead of the big, shiny, new investment building, offering us a building that is in the process of collapse but can still hold beauty within it, right? So he's sculpting the interior of a building that is literally coming down. And you can begin to see the spiral in this image. And the building becomes uninhabitable in the process. Matta Clark was super prescient about real estate. In 1975, you could not possibly have foreseen the real estate era that was about to descend on New York City through the efforts of people like Robert Moses and through the white flight from the city to the suburbs, artists had taken over every square inch of New York and were making and building and participating in these fabulous scenes. But Matta Clark thought he could see something else coming. And so he took these spaces of demolition and he built his messages into them in the form of space. Space, nothing, in other words. So if real estate is all about something, the way that I describe Matta Clark is that he carves nothing out of something. He's literally putting the void into the middle of the structure, and in that way sort of refusing this voracious real estate momentum. So why would this be of interest to trans artists? That's a very reasonable question, and it's a question I've gotten a little bit. There's a branch of theory in trans studies that is deeply interested in the cut. Okay, and you might have read, for anyone who's interested in that, you might have read Ava Haywood's brilliant essay on Starfish and the Cripple, in which she suggests that the cut is possibility. Why? Because the trans body is remade by the cut. The trans body requires the cut. The trans body doesn't need to be repaired. It actually needs to be cut, sutured, taken apart, and not put back together again in a way that then says male or female, but in fact often says something else entirely. So Ava Haywood says, my cut is of my body. It is not the absence of parts of the body. And here you can see in Matta Clark, this is the best example of his use of the cut. And this one's called Splitting, and it's a domestic home that he basically took a sawzall to and sawed down the middle of it. And then in order for the building not to collapse, he had to tip it back on its foundations. So it literally splays open. When it does, you're reminded that at the very heart of the building is nothing, right? So that split in the middle of the building, that's the artwork right there, that gap, reminding you that real estate is speculation and it's walls that are being built around nothing on behalf of ownership. So what Ava Haywood is doing, if we go back to the trans use of the cut, is claiming the cut for a different relationship to the body, when that also opens it up and makes the cut part of embodiment itself. And just as Matta Clark says, Anarchitecture seeks to solve no problem. And here he was really responding to Le Corbusier, whose social engineering architecture had literally sought to manage the problem of poor people in the city. Matta Clark said in response, Anarchitecture seeks to solve no problem. Similarly, Ava Haywood's saying the cut seeks to solve no problem. It isn't a problem to be trans. It is a different way of embodying and inhabiting the body. So here are some of the trans artists that I write about. Top, there's Jessie Darling again with these, you can see in a gallery space, these very precarious structures that are like bodies but not bodies, that are like prosthetic devices that a disabled body might use to get around but are not that. That are some understanding that the body is always dependent upon the prosthetic, and we'll come back to that. This piece down below is by Eve Laris Cohen, and I'll talk about it at the end. And you can see there's an interesting similarity between their work in terms of these twisted pieces of metal, the ruins of something that's being turned into a inscription of transness. And then on the right, some people will recognize Castles, who's a performance artist who literally unmakes his own body in the process of, sculpting something out of clay. All right, so here's the Ava Haywood quote. My cut is of my body and is not the absence of parts of my body. Okay, so I'll just sort of finish up with Jessie Darling, and then we'll move into some of the material that Anarchitecture draws from. This is one of the shows for which Jessie Darling won the Turner Prize, and you can hear the anti-triumphalist, anti-monumental sentiment in the title, no medals, no ribbons. It's a reminder, for example, that war, is not about medals and ribbons. It often leaves people completely disabled. And this is a refusal of a kind of state nationalist, jingoistic relationship to militarism, something that we're hearing a lot about right now. And in relationship to his work, Darling speaks at length about vulnerability and collapse. And this is a great quote from him from an interview in Ocular. He says, "For me, it's quite a hopeful feeling to know," and here think about how collapse is being used, "that even empires fall, kings topple, and governments are overthrown. To know that everything has its end, even when it seems like the reign will be endless. Vulnerability is a given in everyone. It's what makes us alive. It's not that vulnerability is a strength per se, but our physical fragility as organisms and propensity to suffer in love, conflict, and under structural violence, and our animal need for nourishment and warmth are what we share." And so, for people who are like, well, collapse, that doesn't sound like a really great concept, think about how Darling is using it here to say, if we invest in the idea of collapse, we can also use it to think about how empires fall, kings can be toppled, governments are overthrown. But first, we have to learn about collapse and understand its aesthetics and its mechanics. So that's what we're going to do next. All right. So in this section, let's go back to the 1970s and think about why somebody would have come up with this idea of Anarchitecture. And Gordon Matta Clark, by the way, was part of a collective. It wasn't all him, but he was part of a collective. They were living in New York City, in this crumbling down city where buildings would literally fall down overnight, where poor people's buildings were completely abandoned and not improved, even as new modes of gentrification were creeping into the wealthier areas. And in that city emerges this concept of Anarchitecture. We might think about why Anarchitecture has come back around now. There's a million books suddenly on Gordon Matta Clark. I think about 5 came out in the last 5 years. This is after nobody was writing about him. And there was a retrospective of his work at the Bronx in 2016 that was almost nobody went to. Okay, so suddenly we're in the middle of a real estate regime, I would say, an economy absolutely engineered by, dominated by real estate all around Sydney. It's building everywhere. Areas that were abandoned before are now seen as extremely potentially valuable and are being bought up. So this is a moment to be thinking about the critiques of real estate that came out of the 1970s. More than that, though, collapse, and this goes back to the why trans, why queerness in relationship to Anarchitecture, collapse has an erotic kind of orientation to it. So I'm going to play you a clip of a film from, I think it was 1983. It's understood as a prestige documentary. I don't know if people remember Koyaanisqatsi. Do you remember that? Yeah, Koyaanisqatsi. It was by Godfrey Reggio and has a beautiful score by Philip Glass. And it uses, in the way that white people do, it uses this native word, Koyaanisqatsi, from the Hopi language for world out of balance. But it never sort of admits to the fact that the world is out of balance precisely because of settler colonialism. And there's a reason that the Hopi had to have a word for world out of balance, which had everything to do with the settlers. And instead, it just sort of gives you a narrative for the world being out of balance because we have disrespected nature. It's a very sort of universalist narrative. But it's beautiful, okay? In the middle of this film, there's a sequence that is stunning for its kind of erotic sensation. And it's footage of the demolition of a very, very famous housing project called Pruitt Eco. Pruitt Eco was a housing complex that was built, I think in the 1960s, to get poor people out of the slums in St. Louis and put them in a shiny, new, high-rise environment. And it was supposed to be an answer to the problem of urban poverty. It was not accompanied by jobs, by any kind of financial support, by addressing racism, by redistribution of funds, nothing. It was exactly that kind of Le Corbusier idea that you pull people out of one set of architectures and you put them in another, and that will resolve the problem. And I'm not saying Le Corbusier wasn't that simple, but he did think that design held within it the answer to urban disarray. So the proto-ego buildings were understood to be that. Within a short period of time, they became prisons for the people who lived there and were seen as the problem with big government and were torn down. The tearing down of those buildings became a public event, and it was one of the most watched televisual spectacles of the time, and I'm going to show it to you in the way that it appears in the Reggio documentary. Okay, so this is what it looks like. We might. So you can see that there's actually something very weirdly satisfying about and very beautiful about watching these sequences. For me, that blur is very interesting when the facade of the building sort of smears as it comes down, like clearly demolition is an art as well, and the placing of the explosives is designed so that the building doesn't blow up but comes down, okay? So in that sense, this film actually obeys the rhythms of a porn film. If you watch it through, it has a kind of build-up, and you see all of these things going up. You're right. There's a sort of excitement that's built up, and we're watching like erections basically. And then there's this moment that these are the money shots in the porno, and followed by, of course, detumescence. And in that detumescence, you can hear that there's a possibility of, say, an alternative formation of the erotic that is more interested in the detumescence than the erection, that adheres to a different understanding of masculinity, for example. But that film isn't interested in that. That film is just saying these buildings sort of have to go. They're part of the problem. And so the problem is never sort of pinned to the right cause. So we get this incredible sort of pornographic spectacle, and what it reminds us, and this is the point that I want to make, is that architecture and anarchitecture have a sexual charge to them. And so this is, a really important point as to whether then we can hijack the pornography of collapse and unleash from it, from this anarchitectural orientation, a different kind of erotic energy, a queer erotic associated not with urban decline, but with the celebration of the removal of primary obstacles to life otherwise. So in other words, this is just a question I'm posing. Can we think differently about collapse? Can it have an erotics to it? Can we understand it as part of an alternative sexuality on the one hand and an alternative relationship to shelter and living arrangements on the other, that holds to the promise of Pruitt ego, but accompanies it with other forms of social, not reform, radical transformation. So I won't go through all this in the interest of time, but there's tons of material on Pruitt ego. This is the Corbusier fantasy of a machine for living in. That's what the house is supposed to be, and the house is supposed to produce compliant, normative subjects who use the space properly. And so houses, post Le Corbusier, have been imagined and designed in remarkably conventional ways. There's a master bedroom, there's a living space, a dining room, 2 little bedrooms for children. But think of how much architecture our societies produce, and we can't come up with another format for the house. Do you know what I mean? Like, what's the house for people who are not related to each other but want to live together? What would that design be? What is the house for immigrant, precarious communities who need to share space? What does that house look like? We're all about the McMansions, and those are the bloated, drains on our environment. But what about these other spaces that architecture should be imagining and designing, and that actually utopian architects did dream of in the 60s and 70s, but this society has never invested in? So all of these high rises that are all over Sydney now are full of the boxes, full of these boxes with the view, with the nice appliances, and with the bedrooms and so on, all arranged in this utterly conventional way to create a machine for living. So when that's true, we need to get serious about demolition. And there's actually an artist from the 1970s who did just that. And I want to introduce you to her work. That's New York in the 1970s, just so you can understand. This is the Bronx where the Bronx was being torn down for an expressway that absolutely uprooted massive numbers of people of color from places that were cheap and big and good to live in. But it looks like a place after the war. It took a long time for that expressway to be built, and in the meantime, this is what New York looked like. This is the New York of Basquiat. This is the New York of Warhol, the downtown art scene, many of the people who are now in museums. This is also the New York of the Piers and David Wojnarowicz and so on. And this is a better view of Matta Clark working on the spiral in conical intersect in a Paris that was gentrifying in 75. And of course, Paris is gentrifying again for the Olympics. And again, you can see all of these old buildings coming down. So it's a kind of cycle. All right, so this was the image that was used on the poster for the talk tonight. This is Beverly Buchanan. And again, there's a lot of interest in Beverly Buchanan's work suddenly. Beverly Buchanan was considered almost an outsider artist for a long time, certainly a minor artist, and now her works are selling, galleries are showing her what's left of her archive, and there's a return to this architect who is deeply interested both in the environment, also in the afterlife of slavery, and in the remainders after demolition. And that work is what I want to focus on for a moment, okay? Just to see what are the possibilities that are inherent to demolition. I know that sounds like a crazy question, but she actually knows the answer. So Beverly Buchanan moved to New York City in the early 70s, actually to become a public health person. And she enrolled at Columbia and started taking classes in parasitology and was on her way to a medical career when she took a class with Norman Lewis, an abstract black painter, and decided, no, I'm not doing that. I'm going to be an artist. And overnight, she made this decision to become an artist and made, mostly, she's known, and this is interesting, she's known for building little shacks that were reminiscent of slave shacks, shacks that pointed to the precarity of living for people who don't own their homes, and shacks that she painted bright colors and placed all over in the gallery space. But before that, she roamed around demolition sites. And from demolition sites in New York City, she found pieces that were left after a building had come down, and she rebuilt them in her studio. I thought she just grabbed them from the sites, took them back and made sculptures out of them. But what she actually did was went back to the studio and created this tabby concrete, and then recreated the bits left over after demolition. Why did she do that? This is what she says. She said, my interest in walls, and some of those pieces are called urban walls, and others were called city ruins. My interest in walls involves the concept of urban walls when they're in various states of decay. Walls as part of a landscape. Often when buildings are in a state of demolition, one or two structural pieces, which are often called frustula, this is the term for them, stand out that otherwise never would have been created. And I'll say what I think she means by that in a minute. This state of demolition presents a new type of artificial structural system piece that by itself, in its undemolished state, would not exist. These discards or piles of rubble can be pulled together to form new systems. These new systems are very personal statements to me. They're inspired by urban ruins, but are created in my own image, by me, in concrete, and painted with dark paint. Deceptively, they appear to be black. One of my dreams, to place fragments in tall grass where a house once stood, but where now only the chimney bricks remain. This is a deeply enigmatic sentence description, which is why I love it. I think what she's saying is that demolition creates something, a shape, a pattern, a piece that could not have been created by the artist. The random process, or even the planned process of demolition, creates material in association with each other that form structures that give us a clue to other ways of being. So she says these discards or piles of rubble can be pulled together to form new systems. In other words, is there a glimpse of another language and another way of being in the rubble? And I'm not saying out of the old, the new. I'm not saying a phoenix rises from the flames. I think what she's saying is that demolition, as opposed to building, gives us a clue to some other structures that could make up the city otherwise, okay? And she says that they're created in my own image by me. And at another point in her piece called Marsh Ruins, she says, what does it mean for people who are considered derelict to create more dereliction? And she's really interested in that language of the derelict. So this is Beverly Buchanan, and I think that she's giving us a sense of what this language of demolition, dereliction, destitution can do for us. All right, let's move on then. I have two more sections. I'll do this section more quickly so that we can just move to a conclusion. You've listened for a long time and have a conversation. So most cinema about ruins, you know, unless it's super romantic and it's about a romantic ruined castle, sees ruins as something that will be the site of a rebuilding. And this goes back to the very earliest text of cinema. So here's one of the first films made by the Lumiere brothers from 1896. And it was made by accident. And I'll explain how after we watch it. No sound. So the Lumiere brothers were just trying out a camera and trying some visual tricks. And they decided to just take some footage of some guys who were taking down a wall in the Lumiere studios. And this film is called Demolition of a Wall. And there it goes. Very satisfying. We're back to the Koyaanisqatsi. But when the film was played back, the projector put the tape in wrong, and this happens. Watch him walking. Oh, suddenly he's going backwards. And, oh no, the wall is being rebuilt. And this was sort of, they were sort of mad, this is a disaster, oh my God. And then they're like, this is cinema. This is cinema. That you can take something that was demolished a moment ago and you rebuild it. You put it back together again perfectly. And this is a fantasy that we entertain. Don't look at that from them. I'll just run. There we go. This is a fantasy that we allow ourselves to indulge because of cinema and because of the televisual and because of our screens. We imagine that what comes down, can immediately go back up. And so this is a fantasy of a world in total flux that can move backwards and forwards in time. And Benjamin, of course, was the one who explained how cinema had completely changed our understanding of reality through these montage sequences on the one hand, but also the fact that time was very flexible in cinema, and you can reverse the course of time, as we just saw. Robert Smithson, on the other hand, suggested that, quote, the cinema offers only an elusive or temporary escape from physical dissolution. So I think what we're trying to do with Collapse is resist this fantasy that everything that comes down can immediately go back up, and sit and be comfortable with the Anarchitectural archive of Collapse, within which I propose we might find tips and clues about how to unmake the world. Now, the actual term collapse is quite interesting because it holds within it the idea not just that something comes down, it's actually from the Latin meaning many things falling together. Many things falling together. So there's a kind of collectivity and an assemblage within Collapse that lets us think about all of these gestures that orient towards falling and away from making, building, improving, and then embrace, if you like, the beauty of gradual and inevitable decay. Now, for an example and an illustration then of this, the beauty of Collapse, it's helpful to turn, in fact, to dance. And I was reading some essays on particularly Black choreography, and I found this beautiful piece by Anna Martine Whitehead, for whom falling is a very big part of Black choreography. And she writes, the relationship between Blackness, queer vulnerability, and the mechanics of movement and dance is what she's interested in. She says that her essay uses anecdotes to make an argument for downward movement and concaveness as movement techniques, responses to the physical threats intrinsic to Black ontology. And you can hear a kind of Afro-pessimist statement in there, where she's saying, just as Western ballet, white European ballet is all about the orientation towards leaping and being in the air for long periods of time, she says, is it possible that because of the constant physical threats to the Black body, that Black choreographies have been more interested in falling, in collapse, in orientation to the ground rather than to the air? And she talks at one point about, bodies falling out of the slave ship as providing some of this choreography, which is, if you read Christina Sharp's work or Saidiya Hartman's work, that kind of falling, or Zong, these are actually part of Black history. This is Black history, not simply the facts of slavery and so-called emancipation, but these acts of the complete disposability of the Black body. Whitehead proposes to incorporate that understanding of Blackness into Black choreography rather than repelling it. And she continues, freedom is the moment of recognition that collapse is not only inevitable, but critical as well as continuous. Freedom is the moment you might have fallen, but have everyone convinced otherwise. I like that idea of precarity, which is totally built into those sculptures by Darling and others that I was showing you. She says, we do not stop collapsing. Okay, now a nice example of that to build upon this is to think about the Vogue suicide dip. And I think when I say that, you probably already know what I mean. You know, the Vogue move where people collapse onto their back foot. And it's a very dramatic move. It's a crazy move because there's no way that you're not going to pop your hips out at some point, I imagine. I know there are dancers in the room who will advise. But for example, Kevin Aviance, who's a wonderful drag and dance performer in the New York City ball scene, has had both of their hips replaced precisely from the brutality of this particular gesture that nonetheless remains totally central to voguing. And Whitehead writes, I don't have the quote for this, both the break and the dip are a sharp turn away from European-derived movement language in which the body labors to present order, to stiffen and rise. Now you can hear the echo of Koyaanisqatsi there. Both the break and the dip offer to audiences the desire, the challenge, the contagion of collapse. And this is what it looks like. You can see like the emphasis, the climax here is the fall, and it's really kind of a broken fall because the fall is broken by the back leg, which in turn is broken by the fall. But it's a very beautiful way of conjuring that same erotic of collapse that we saw earlier in those buildings and turning it into a different language, if you like. So it's that downward momentum that interests me there. And I think to finish that thought then, I think you could say that, that there's a way in which the body creates a kind of a letter or a code in the same way that Beverly Buchanan proposed that the Demolition piece is also part of a language that we cannot yet read. One leg is out, the other leg is back in underneath the body, and the voguers spell out in this way a complex message of loss, flexibility, risk, and survival. So there's yet another formulation of collapse that holds within it some clues about breaking, undoing, and remaking. All right, I'm just going to conclude then. I know this is a lot of material, but I'm looking, and I know you'll help me find some of the through lines that connect these various scenes of collapse and of these vocabularies to each other on behalf of this semi-utopian project of thinking how to unmake the world. So let's go back to this piece, the roller coaster, governed by entropy rather than thrilling people in its defiance of entropy, because that's what the roller coaster does. It says, no, we're not going to go off the rails, but you are. You're always going to go off the rails. That's what entropy is. We all will die, and that's kind of the roller coaster is bringing you to that horrible realization, even as it places you at the very edge of mortality. This piece appeared in the show that Jesse did in the Kunstverein Freiburg Museum, an art gallery in southwest Germany that had been converted from a former swimming pool that had been used by the Third Reich. And so he felt like it was redolent with this fascist energy. And so in the place where people had swum to create these sort of perfect bodies that were preferred by the Reich, he creates a twisty, goofy apparatus that implies goofy and twisted bodies that would ride upon it, or that would become twisted from riding upon it. And it's a real critique of a kind of aesthetic of purity. This is what he says about it. The space that Gravity Road was built as a swimming pool under the Third Reich. It feels like that. I very much felt it when I went in. It's huge, a big swimming pool with a balcony around the top that made me think about Leni Riefenstahl and fascist obsessions with perfect bodies, but also of this kind of idea of leisure and there being a certain way to be at leisure. With this balcony, it's not like looking down into the marketplace or, I don't know, the kids' playground where things just fall and tumble around on each other. It's about a kind of surveillance. There's a particular construction in this architecture of leisure as imagined by the Nazis in this part of Germany at that time. There are these huge pillars where you come in, they're kind of modernist sans serif, but they also have the same effect of Greco-Roman pillars, the temple, the Great Hall. So again, the language here is anti-monumentalist, to put into a space where a sort of grand theory of history has played out, to put into that space something that is more reminiscent of the kids' playground, where things just tumble and fall around on each other. You can see it is kind of a childish piece. It's like a climbing frame or something from a playground that nonetheless you could not use without injuring yourself. So he's reckoning with the past history of the space. He's associating his own sculptures with childish architectures and resisting the panoptic space of the building. So I would propose that Jesse Darling's work and the last artist I'm going to very briefly talk about, Eve Laris-Cohen, these are artists who are interested in what's now being called in European theory, or has been for a while, destitution. And destitution is the kind of theoretical frame within which to think about collapse and unbuilding and unmaking. Destitution is a kind of anti-world, anti-colonial mode of thought that seeks to take everything apart. And you can hear it in this article where Ahrens and Robinson say that destitution is the idea that you might tear down, dismantle, and cancel prevailing political representations and institutions without proposing others to replace them. And that's an important piece. Remember, in the ruins in reverse, the ball comes down and then it comes back up. In New York in the 1970s, the city came down and then it's rebuilt. It's the space created by refusing to replace what has come down that we find the potential of destitution. Okay, so destitution, here you go. Eve Laris-Cohen made a beautiful sculpture after he rushed to the site where a beloved theater in Massachusetts had burned down right before COVID, 2019. A theater at the Jacob's Pillow Dance Theater burned to the ground, and everyone was sort of very, very sad about the loss of this theater. But Laris-Cohen rushed to the site and pulled all of this material out of the burned building and used it to create another show. And this is the show, and it was called Conservation, I believe. But at the same time that he was doing this, he was suffering from Crohn's disease, which is a really horrible gastrointestinal disorder where the bowel sort of eats itself. And so you can see that what he's pulled out is the sort of the innards of the building. And he arranged them in the gallery space and then used this machine to raise and lower the apparatus and the frame. And use them to become a kind of unstable foundation for performance. And this is what he said about it. He said that he refused to say what caused the fire, just as he refused to say why he was trans, or he refused to think about what caused his illness. He says, this comes from both a trans and crip sensibility, from my desire to resist or refuse others' desires to know, whether it be gendered anatomical details or the cause of my chronic illness, which incidentally could also be classified as undetermined. The fire is undetermined, his illness is undetermined, and the sculpture that he brought to the gallery, people just couldn't make sense of it, and he refuses to explain it. And to me, that's the destitute gesture. That's the kind of anarchitectural momentum of pulling things from the wreckage and refusing to build something new, displaying the innards, reveling in the site where things have come undone. Jesse Darling also suffered from a terrible illness right when he was building Gravity Road. He had a neurological illness that made him think more carefully too about fragility, disability, debility, and so on. Now, when the Turner Prize, and this is my conclusion, when the Turner Prize was announced a few weeks ago, Darling, in his acceptance speech, took the time to criticize narrow conceptions of art, market dynamics, and elitism, and then pulled a Palestinian flag out of his pocket, making clear the connections between elitism, the art market, prizes, global capitalism, ableism, apocalypse, and militarism. His gesture reminds us about what is at stake in these recalibrations of the meaning of falling, collapsing, demolishing, and destituting. While Israel, backed by the US and Germany, brutally removes indigenous people from their land, wastes the land in order to resettle, rebuild, and wipe away, replace all traces of original inhabitants, it becomes increasingly important to counter these brutal operations not just with protest and noise, but with our own demolition operations. We need, Darling's work proposes, to unmake the institutional structures that make political speech so hard right now, that line up powerful governments behind conquerors, and that force us to accept poor governance over alternative forms of sociality. The title of my talk is All Fall Down, and it refers, of course, to the nursery rhyme figure Humpty Dumpty. Humpty Dumpty lives and dies by the second law of thermodynamics, according to which, quote, the total entropy of a system either increases or remains constant in any spontaneous process. It never decreases. It never decreases. In other words, heat cannot travel from a colder body to a warmer one. Order cannot resolve brokenness. Entropy or disorder increases over time. If you fall and break, you cannot be put back together again the way you were. Worlds break, Jesse Darling's work tells us over and over again. We have to resist the urge to put that world back together. And we must resist that urge, or to pull the shards into passable shapes, to form facsimiles of unbroken life. Instead, these installations lead us into the break itself and ask us to find a spot among these loopy steel rails, the fallen figures, the debris, and the junk. Once in the heart of demolition, we see that the future is not ours. We cannot take it, dream it, buy it, or occupy it. It is now, it's here, and it's over. Thank you.
We have now some time for questions, which I'm sure there's many. And we have roving mics as well, so if you want to stick your hand up, yes.
Hello, thank you so much. That was so deeply interesting, and the layers of thought, and wow, I'm still reeling, and
Thank you as well.
to the gem of that thought. I guess my question, it still has to do with a question that I asked last night, which discusses this idea of ruination, ruins, and then I think something that prompted me to ask this question is when you talked about the erotics of buildings falling down and considering them as an alternative sexuality. Yet to me, I was kind of like troubled when I see these buildings that, as you yourself said, like housed poor people, or were kind of like this marker of like people who are dispossessed, or people who are undergoing gentrification. Yet for me, particularly for some of us who might be, whose politics leans towards a certain side, the most erotic image that defines our culture of buildings falling down is the 9/11 buildings, the Twin Towers falling down. And I think because so much of it is couched in this idea of terrorism that we can't possibly include it in talks like this because obviously surveillance, but we don't often talk about the fact that it was an act of strategic brilliance on the part of the people who did it, but also for many people saw it as a significant attack on the imperialist capitalist structures of America that were so represented by those towers, but also the Pentagon as well. So I wonder, how do we talk about that kind of ruination, that kind of destruction, and its eroticized nature, or maybe we even talk about the fact that we can't possibly eroticize it because of anti-terror laws or things like that. But I think a lot of what you're talking about and what you spoke about earlier was about wildness, about terror, about uncontained trans and queer and Black and Indigenous bodies. And I think of Marsha P. Johnson saying that she moves with a certain freedom, and I quote, "If they attack me, I'll stop them with my bomb." Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Sue Ellen, right? Yeah. In this archive of Collapse, I actually used the film Born in Flames by Lizzie Borden, which is a Black feminist film made in the 1970s. It's a speculative fiction in which the revolution has supposedly already taken place, but women and minorities are still on the outs. And the film ends with a telegraph tower on the top of the World Trade Center being blown up. And it's sort of shocking, in terms of what you were just saying, it's shocking to go back to that film and think about what the World Trade Center represented to people, and the fact that this queer film from the 1980s imagined this explosion. Now, it wasn't the World Trade Center per se that was being blown up and Born in Flames. It's the transmission tower on the top, because the goal is to sort of disrupt media. But one of the nice details about the production history of that film is that when they had to create the sensation of an explosion, they used glitter. And so it's literally a sort of glitter bombing that gives that sense. But I want to attend to that question, Suella, because I was thought, wow, how weird it is that I've never, after doing this project for 6 years, I haven't thought, oh, what about that footage of 9/11 and of the World Trade Center's towers coming down that we watch over and over again, and that is available on Instagram as its own ruin porn now. But that, as you're saying, we cannot claim for anything precisely because it's protected, in the same way that you can't say anything about Gaza without mentioning the brutality of Hamas. These are protected speech acts. And yet, that's some of the only footage we have of, as you say, a strategic attack on the centers of power that a project like this seems to be interested in bringing down. So I think it's I've got to think about that, and of course, one risks a lot saying that 9/11 offers us a spectacle of what it would look like for the world to come down. In the US, that would be seen as some kind of insane violation of national speech, right? But it's weird that I haven't actually thought about it. Like, I'm thinking about myself, that I've either so completely, sequestered that material that it didn't come to me in the way that, yeah, we can watch the pulling down of poor people's houses, the pro and eco buildings, but we couldn't put the Twin Towers in there and say, here we actually do have image from the last 30 years of attacks on the centers of power, the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. This is the kind of material that we could call Anarchitecture. Let me think about it.
Can I just add something to this question? Shortly. It's not a question, thank you for your lecture, but I just wanted to add, I don't know if you're aware of the fact that the architect of both Puritago and World
Did the World Trade Center,
yeah.
Yeah,
So,
that exactly.
That's kind of a fascinating coincidence, I think. Yeah.
That's so true, and both of his buildings are Japanese architect. I did know that, and even then, why wasn't I thinking about it?
I was also going to add that it's notable that the state's memorialization of that site was in fact not a monument, but to cut into the ground
Yes.
in the sort of a reworking of a Matta
Right,
Clark
but then
esque.
Yeah, sort of, but then there's these two beams of light,
Mm.
which has all kinds of weird connotations. Sorry.
Hi, good evening. I'm Naomi, and it's just surreal that one of the writers of the key text that I used in my dissertation is here. So I will be fangirling. But anyhow, I'd want to focus on the neo-colonialism aspect of this whole lecture. And I wonder, in the conversation of ruins and collapse and everything and unmaking, unlearning, where does the discussion, where in the conversation do we involve the collectivity and pluralism, especially among marginalized peoples, especially I'm Filipino, so it's all, I know that there are a lot of insights from Black academics, Black thinkers, but I'm wondering how about those from Southeast Asia and Latin America who have, formed movements based on grassroots movements and who have endeavored to, destabilize a lot of, capitalist patriarchal structures through collective efforts, and lesbian feminists weaponizing their femininity, which they want to, embody as not the antithesis of masculinity, or not to suppress, the gradation of, gender performativity and identity, but also being included in the conversation and, the stabilization of structures. So I was just wondering about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I tend to turn to the work of Veronica Gago from Argentina, who wrote a book called The Feminist International, How to Change Everything. And one of the things that she calls for, which I think is very consistent with this destitution argument, is that we have to stop the world. And which sounds like a Broadway musical or something, but it's actually part of her orientation towards the general strike. And she reworks Rosa Luxemburg's idea, the general strike, which was the idea that people in industrial environments would all stop working and walk out at the same time and bring business to a halt. But it's a reworking that recognizes that most precarious communities do not work in these industrialized workplaces or even in formal economies anymore. And therefore, stopping the world means uniting workers in informal economies, like sex work or like sweatshop labor or whatever. That's the work that has to stop, because otherwise we don't even see how much depends upon that labor. And so she and her comrades in Argentina have managed to unite a kind of theoretical idea of the strike with various kinds of anti-colonial theories, and then with what she calls massification. In other words, getting as many people out into the streets as possible, which has happened in the past 5 years in Chile and Argentina, and in Brazil too. But notice that we still have right-wing governments back in charge in those places. This is where we clearly have not found the proper political language yet to oppose this new wave of authoritarian capital. But yes, absolutely. I mean, what you're describing, this kind of anti-colonial opposition to building, is definitely part of this project too. Yeah, thank you. Now.
There was a question up the front here as well. Mike's coming down to you. I also note that we've reached our kind of end time, but with your patience, maybe we have an extra 5 or 10 minutes. I feel like it's much cooler in here than it is outside.
That's
anyway,
true.
so.
Thank you very much. My name is Peter. I really enjoyed the passion and excitement. I'm excited. I was thinking about deconstruction, or the intellectual movement called deconstruction, which is obviously very popular in the 90s and 2000s, but it's kind of waning a bit. But at one point, Derrida said that deconstruction was what happened. And it's not about, in a way, repairing or fixing or reconstructing. It's about a kind of an unraveling that is always happening, even when we think we're building and making things.
Yeah.
And what you're talking about, and there is a movement of architecture called deconstructive architecture as well, which I know is very elite and so on, and sort of not quite working the way that you're working, but there are queers in deconstruction, a few of them. So I was just wondering if you had thought about it.
I mean, not really, in the sense that deconstruction just really remains such a arcane discourse in some way. I mean, it kind of didn't want to come out of the academy in some sense. And I think there are a lot of legacies of deconstruction that are continuing the work in the way that you've described it, which is in many ways much more interesting, like this is what happens anyway. And going with that kind of entropic flow of meaning, of desire, whatever it may be. But I'm sort of interested in degrowth architecture, I think. There are some movements in architecture that are trying to push back on this just endless building, for mostly not for habitation, but for investment. And I think it's a good moment to just sort of investigate where some of the radical architecture practices are happening, less than investigating where the radical theory practices are. Those radical theory practices are much more available in, for example, abolitionist thought. The people who want to get rid of, those of us who want to get rid of prisons and who do not think that whatever we're calling democracy is at all representative or contributing to just outcomes, right? Abolitionist theory and practice seems to me to be the corollary for an architecture. Yeah. Careful.
My face. Hi Jack, obsessed. Love it. Ruination, very good. Everything that I feel like the trans zeitgeist, we're decaying in it. I have a lot of thoughts about entropy. And like, I don't know, I've just been like, I did like a permaculture course like a few years ago, and then I became obsessed with syntropy, which is like the continuation, right? The continuing, the constant, even when things are being slashed and falling down, there's a type of natural continuation in relationship to matter and material that is kind of consistently creating life with a practice of death. So within that kind of cycle, I was thinking also about what you mentioned about like this. Actually, I haven't heard this suicide dip before, and I would like to propose the syntropy dip because actually I feel like the dip, although that there is a kind of obsession with its the climax of it as a kind of ending of a sentence or like a 5, 6, 7 dip on an 8 or the dip on a 4, it's actually within the language of the floor performance and the even the pre-elements that go before the dip is the kind of creates a kind of cycle or a central fugal force, energy, spiritual, ritualistic thing that actually just brings the dip into the floor, then keeps on continuing into the ground, and so on and so on. And then there's a kind of ritual, grounded floor sensibility that happens with it as well. And I feel like sometimes we get so obsessed with the dip that, yeah, it does feel like an entropic kind of way of being. And I think, I don't know, it's not that I understand like the kind of, where we're moving into kind of a nihilistic end of hope thing, but I think like even like this kind of like thing that like Bayo Kamalafe talks about, like the end of hope and all these kind of monsters that come from there. And maybe even some of the works that we talked about, like there is a type of relationship with the matter that's on the floor. Yeah, I don't know, I'm just kind of like thinking that as a way of life and a way of like just a type of what continues, what's after that, what's actually when the thing gets blown up, and then when the rubble is left, when the ruins are left, and when the humans walk away, then how does the subaltern then begin to have a conversation when everyone leaves the building? Walks away from the building.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, that's just a beautiful description of that choreography, so much better than I could say, in a sense, because you're right that what happens online is that the dip is just edited, yeah, as it was with that beat, so that the cadence always is endlessly like looping through the dip, so that the body is just falling. When, exactly as you say, there's a lot of floor work usually that leads up to that. Voguing is many different gestures, right? And that punctuation is used, no doubt, at a certain moment for a certain reason. But when it emerges on YouTube or Instagram, it's like the money shot. We only get the dip. But I think the spiraling down is interesting. I want to think about this exactly as you said, the choreography that is taking place on the ground that continues after the dip. That there might be other registers to this. Syntropy, wow, okay. Just wrote it down and we'll investigate, yeah. I mean, I'm trying not to go to the repair, that's the problem, right? Yeah, intellectually this is a problem because as soon as you say, we want to pull things down and then see what's left, within that, there's a sense of like, yes, and then we'll rebuild, right? But we don't want to go there. The rebuilding will inevitably be the same. It's like a cancer. It will regrow in the same place. So what we have to do is learn to think, and I think that this is what you're teaching, learn to think beyond the ending without there being a new beginning. The continuation after. And let's just call that syntropy and there for the moment. Thank you.
I feel like we should wrap up, not least to preserve Jack's energy, because tomorrow night, Jack will be one of the lineup in Queer PowerPoint, which will be at the Seymour Centre at the University of Sydney. And there are still tickets left if you don't already have one.
But you have to say what I'm going to talk about. So my queer PowerPoint is I'm going to make the case against pets. Bring your dogs.
Thank you all very much for coming tonight, and thank you very much, Jack.
Thank you.